Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, I am Dr. Shabnam Mehlawat, an Associate Professor from the Faculty of Law, University of Delhi. This is my lecture number 5 and it is on the International Convention of United Nations Framework of Convention on Climate Change. I will be discussing the concepts, the convention itself, how it took place, what are the ingredients of that convention, what were its drawbacks and what were its achievements, and how over a period of time we have made certain decisions with respect to the protection of climate and the changes that have taken place. The United Nations Climate Convention on Climate Change talks about, it is a recognition was given to the convention. The everyday increase in the greenhouse gases concentrations were felt across the countries in the atmospheric levels. The recognition of the fact of its origins from the developed countries, the role and importance in terrestrial and marine ecosystems of sinks and reservoirs of the greenhouse gases. It called for a cooperative and a collaborative efforts based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. Earlier it was initiated by the advanced or the developed countries, and they were the ones who were responsible for the pollution which was created because of the industrialization that took place in their countries. And they brought out the principle that we all share a common concern of protecting the environment, and especially when it is related to climate change. But each country has a different responsibility to bear whatever is our common loss by way of climate change. So, accepting the principles of the Stockholm Declaration of 1972, it called for enactment of domestic legislations in each country. This was equity principle was recognized that we must bring down the disparity between the rich and the poor and the present generation and the future generations, keeping in mind the rights of the unborn child. This equity principle is based on the same as will be talked about in the concept of sustainable development. The recognition of help to be taken from the various agencies like the United Nations Environment Programme, the World Meteorological Organization and other United Nations bodies. They were the ones who helped in bringing about this convention. They talked about research and cooperation between countries to be carried out. Energy efficiency should be achieved and environment-friendly fuels to be used. Affirming that responses to the climate change should be coordinated with social and economic development, which is that we must protect our environment. Meanwhile, development also must take place, and development requires money, and money is the economics which is related to the protection of environment. It should be done in an integrated manner with a view to avoid adverse impacts on the latter, taking into account the full legitimate priority needs of the developing countries for the achievement of sustained economic growth and the eradication of poverty, recognizing that all countries, especially developing countries, need access to the resources which are required to develop. To achieve sustainable social and economic development, and in order for the developing countries to progress toward their goals, the energy consumption will need to grow, taking into account the possibilities for achieving greater energy efficiency and controlling the greenhouse gas emissions in general, including through the application of new technologies on terms which make such an application economically and socially beneficial, determined to protect the climate system for the present and the future generations. The framing and the objectives. The concerns at the time of the convention was drafted, there was ecosystems, food production and economic development. Health and other issues were not explicitly mentioned. Their importance became clear with subsequent research and experience. Under Article 2 of the Convention, stabilization of the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at the level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate change. Such a level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to the climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. Sustainable development, as it says, that we must develop and we must protect our environment and the resources. So, sustainable development talks about a balanced approach to any problem, that we must balance our economics and our environment to leave a sustainable development which would take place. The definitions which are given under the convention are important, that is, the adverse effects of climate change. It means changes in the physical environment of biota resulting from the climate change which have significant deleterious effects on the composition, resilience or productivity of natural and managed ecosystems, or on the operation of socio-economic systems, or on human health and welfare. The next important definition is climate change. It is a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere, and which is in addition to the natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. That is, between time periods they are measured to see how the climate is changing. The system or the climate system means the totality of the atmosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere and geosphere and their interactions between all the four spheres. Emissions of the greenhouse gases or their precursors of the environment into the atmosphere over a specified area and a period of time. The greenhouse gases, it means the gaseous constituents of the atmosphere, both natural and anthropogenic, that absorb and remit infrared radiation. The Regional Economic Integration Organization means that organization which is constituted by sovereign states of a given region which has competence in respect of matters governed by the convention or its protocols and has been duly authorized in accordance with its internal procedures to sign, ratify, accept, approve or accede to the instruments. Every convention requires firstly the signatures, then they require ratifications and then acceptance of a particular number of countries for that convention to come into force, the approval which is required, and they all accede to the decisions which are taken under the convention and their follow up respective protocols. Reservoir means component or components of the climate change where the greenhouse gas or a precursor of the greenhouse gas is stored. Sink means any process, activity, mechanism which removes a greenhouse gas, an aerosol or a precursor of the greenhouse gas from the atmosphere. Source means any process, activity which releases a greenhouse gas, an aerosol or a precursor of the greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. Commitments under the convention. The commitments, as we have previously talked about, it works on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility or the CBDR principle, and it allocates responsibilities. We gather data on the greenhouse gases, lower their levels systematically by each country according to its status. We promote and cooperate in the development, application and diffusion, including transfer of technologies, practices and processes that control, reduce or prevent anthropogenic emissions of the greenhouse gases not controlled by the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol refers to that convention, which is a Vienna Convention on depletion of the ozone layer, which also had identified certain chemicals responsible for the depletion. So, this convention specifically leaves out those chemicals and those substances which are specifically covered under the Vienna Convention. So, we promote sustainable management, promote and cooperate in the conservation and enhancement as appropriate of sinks and reservoirs of all the greenhouse gases. We cooperate in preparing for the adaptation to the impacts of climate change. That is, the changes which are taking place due to climate change, we have to adapt to the new environments, to the new changes which are coming. In case we are not able to do that, then the survival is not possible. We develop and elaborate appropriate and integrated plans for coastal zone management, water resources, agriculture, and for the protection and rehabilitation of areas, particularly in the continent of Africa, which is always affected by drought and desertification, as well as flash floods which often take place in those regions of the world. It divided the developed world into Annex 1 and Annex 2 countries for imputing financial liability, and then the developing and the underdeveloped countries for the purpose of helping them control the greenhouse gases. There were finances and transfer of technology to the non-annex countries. The non-annex countries are those countries which would be receiving these finances and technology. Annex 1 and Annex 2 countries are those which would be providing those finances, and those countries which are rich, which are developed, but would not actually be giving the finances because of their transitional status. There is research and systematic observation, awareness creation, division of countries, Annex 1, Annex 2 and the non-annex countries and the least developed countries. So, the conference of parties is another important point under the convention. That is, a conference of parties takes place every year to discuss or to make certain decisions with respect to climate change, whether there are researches, whether they are decisions, whether they are something which needs to be implemented. All these have taken place over a period of time till date in several countries, and they have been listed on the website of the United Nations to show what decision has been taken under what COP agreement. So, the COP is a superior decision making body of the convention. They are parties to the convention that are presented at the COP, at which they review the implementation of the convention and other legal instruments that the COP adopts and takes decisions. It is necessary to promote the effective implementation of the convention, including the institutional and administrative arrangements. A key task for the COP is to review the national communications and emission inventories which are submitted by the parties. Based on this information, the COP assesses the effects of measures taken by the parties and the progress which is made in achieving the objective of the convention. This takes place, as I said, every year. Unless the parties decide otherwise. The first meeting was held in Berlin, Germany in March 1995. The COP meet in Bonn, the seat of the Secretariat, unless a party offers to host the session. So, the COP presidency rotates among the 5 recognized United Nations regions, which is Africa, Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, Central and Eastern Europe and Western Europe and others. So, there is a tendency for the venue of the COP to shift among these groups. The timeline of the development, the first meeting, as I stated, it has taken place in Berlin. The parties demanded commitments from the developed countries. COP2, Geneva Ministerial Declaration. The Declaration of Geneva was not adopted. A decision on criteria of the developing nations national communication was adopted to assess progress which was made under COP1 and opposition of the oil producing countries and industrialized organizations throughout the meet. In COP3 in Kyoto, Japan, it set legally binding emission objectives for developed countries. They wanted in this decision to decrease the greenhouse gases by 5.2% from 1990 levels. So, this resulted in a real fallout between the countries, and it is an important decision which was there because US, who was one of the largest emitters, backed out of this decision and did not want to implement the same. So, in the first commitment period from 2008 and 2012, Annex 2 countries agreed to legally bound reductions in the greenhouse gases of 6 to 8% below 1990 levels. In COP4, they agreed for a 2-year plan of action to enhance efforts and develop procedures for implementing the Kyoto Protocol by the year 2000. In COP5, primarily it was convened to settle technological issues like the transfer of technology from Annex 1 country to non-annex countries and to build capacity building amongst them. In the COP6 meeting, the consensus was reached on the so-called Bonn Agreement, and the parties agreed on capacity building arguments of developing countries. COP7, the parties agreed on a package deal including rules for ensuring compliance with its commitments and consideration of certain principles, such data and limited banking of units generated by the sinks under the Clean Development Mechanism. COP8 in 2002 took place in Delhi, where the delegates agreed on the principles for financing a fund to help the poor nations cope with the effect of climate change. The mechanism was agreed to be set up to protect the forest cover as a weapon for combating climate change. Forest cover is where the carbon sinks are situated, and it helps absorb the negative air which is emitted because of the greenhouse gas emissions. So, they work as a proper deterrent for the changes which take place in climate change in a positive manner. In COP9, 2 types of new funds were created: the Special Climate Change Fund and the Least Developed Countries Fund, which would support technology transfer, adaptation projects and other activities. The adopted decisions focus on institutions, procedures of the Kyoto Protocol and implementation of the UNFCCC. Emphasis was given to strengthening the institutional framework of both the Convention and the Kyoto Protocol. New emissions reporting guidelines as suggested by the International Panel on Climate Change were adopted. In COP10, it evaluated the progress of the first conference of the parties 10 years along with potential difficulties, with a particular focus on climate change, mitigation and adaptation. Discussions were held on the post-Kyoto methods for allocating emission reduction commitments after 2012, when the first commitment period expired. The other timelines are COP11. This decision was procedure for the future of UNFCCC beyond 2012. Montreal Protocol was created to extend the life of the Kyoto Protocol beyond its expiration of 2012 and negotiate further reductions in the greenhouse gases. COP12 went on to a wide range of resolutions were agreed to assist countries in adapting to its repercussions. Agreement on the action for coming years under the Nairobi Work Programme impacts, vulnerability and adaptation, as well as the management of the Kyoto Protocol's Adaptation Fund. Parties praised the Nairobi Framework 12, which will provide extra assistance to developing countries in developing their Clean Development Mechanism initiatives. In COP13, the Bali Action Plan was a result of this COP. It proposed a unified vision for long-term collaborative action on 4 essential elements, which was mitigation, adaptation, finance and technology. So, the ad hoc working group on the long-term cooperative action under the convention was formed as a new subsidiary organization to conduct negotiations. COP14, the Kyoto Protocol established the Adaptation Fund, which would be funded by a 2% fee on the CDM projects. Parties agreed that the Adaptation Fund Board should have the legal authority to offer developing countries immediate access. The parties also agreed to intensify negotiations in the year 2009. In COP15, it resulted in the Copenhagen Accord, which was backed by the majority of governments. A group of developing countries committed to reporting on their efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions every 2 years. In terms of long-term financing, industrialized countries are committed to supporting a goal of generating $100 billion per year by 2020 to meet the requirements of the developing nations. In COP16 in 2010, the Cancun Agreement was created. It was to commit a maximum temperature rise of 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, launch a technology framework, and to accelerate the development and diffusion of the climate-friendly technologies and establish a Green Climate Fund. A new Cancun adaptation framework was also agreed, which included the formation of an adaptation committee, which would support committee to support strong unified adaptation activity. COP17, parties agreed to COP17 to adopt a worldwide climate deal by 2015, with work kicking up under a new committee dubbed the Ad hoc Working Group on the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, or the ADP. Parties also agreed to extend the Kyoto Protocol's second commitment term to January 1, 2013. A greatly expanded structure for reporting emission reductions for both developed and developing countries was also agreed upon, taking the idea of shared but different responsibilities into account. COP18 in the Doha Conference 2012, parties established a timeline for the adoption of a universal climate agreement by 2015, with implementation beginning in 2020. They finished the work under the Bali Action Plan so that they could focus on a new work towards a 2015 agreement under a single negotiating stream, the ADP. They emphasized the importance of increasing their aim to reduce the greenhouse gases and assist vulnerable nations in adapting. With the approval of the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol, a second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol was also established, which lasted from 1st January 2013 to 31st December 2020. So, Doha was a very important conference which was held because many strong decisions were taken in the Doha conference in 2012, because the fallout of the decisions of the Convention on Climate Change and non-implementation by certain countries was leading to a disastrous effect on the climate, and they thought of taking some concrete efforts. This was one of the first steps which they took towards acceptance by all countries, the provisions of the convention. In COP19, the governments enhanced the timeline of development for the 2015 agreement. They began to intensify domestic preparations for intended nationally determined contributions towards the agreement, as they were ready well before December 2015 and ideally by the first quarter of 2015. The decision was made for a clear and transparent submission of the NDCs, and the developed parties were urged to provide support to the developing countries in achieving the same. Developed countries were keen on ensuring that climate negotiations should focus on reducing emissions in the agriculture sector. In COP20, a historic agreement was done where countries would specify their objectives, submit their carbon dioxide emissions inventory. The first multilateral assessment was held in Lima, providing greater transparency for action by developed countries, so they can compare their degree of compliance with the emission reduction goals. The conference also agreed that contribution of countries had to be more than their current commitments. The timeline again in COP21, the Paris Agreement of 2015. This was a very strong agreement which came into force, where they stated that it is no longer optional for the parties not to join. It is now an equal distribution of responsibility over each country, which should take their decisions in implementing the reduction of the greenhouse gases. A decision was agreed with immediate effect to accelerate the implementation of the Paris Agreement climate action after it entered into force, affirming the goal of limiting global temperature increase well below 2 degrees Celsius, while urging efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. All parties have made binding commitments to make their nationally determined contributions to ensure domestic measures are adopted at their doorstep. reaffirming that rich countries' obligation under the UNFCCC to support poor countries, and for the first time encouraged voluntary contributions from developing countries. Agreements also expressly recognize the principle of equity and the CBDR as well as their respective capacities. In COP22, the Marrakesh in Morocco climate change conference was held in 2016, and they said the spirit of Paris was to be followed. In COP23, they raised awareness of the vulnerability of the small islands and all nations, and it opened the door for more collaboration and support for resilient communities and the transition to growth powered by clean energy, they said at the event. And the respective subsequent COP agreements have also taken place, and the last one which was held was in Dubai. Now coming down to the Framework Convention itself. It is an international process for negotiating agreements on climate change, a series of agreements which have reached on promoting adaptation, including international funding for adaptation. Health has been poorly represented in the agreements and adaptation funding. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, provides comprehensive scientific assessments to inform the negotiations. The historical aspect of this convention is that science and politics of climate change have been 100 years old, although they were not spoken of in the same manner as is done in the Convention on Climate Change. It is historically important, though, that it took place in Toronto Conference on the Changing Atmosphere in 1988, Implications of the Global Security, and in the Stockholm Declaration in 1972. Then the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted by the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro, or the Earth Summit as it is commonly known, in 1992. This convention, it was an international treaty to address challenges of the climate change. 192 countries have ratified, and it entered into force on 21st March 1994. This convention recognized the global shared problem, provided a framework for discussion. The first steps were the reporting, the assessment and a planning, and established the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, and it covered mitigation and adaptation. Then came the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice. The SBSTA, it supports the work of the conference of the parties and the MOP through the provision of timely information, advice on scientific and technological matters as they relate to the convention or the Kyoto Protocol. The key areas of its work are impacts, vulnerability and adaptation, emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries, promoting the development and transfer of environment-friendly technologies. On the issues of deforestation, they said in Brazil, in the last few years, all the forests have vanished, which were the last sources of carbon sinks, which was established under their forest covers. So, promoting the development and transfer of environment-friendly technologies, technical work to improve the guidelines for preparing and reviewing the greenhouse gas emission inventories from Annex 1 parties. The subsidiary body of implementation, the SBI and the SBSTA, they work together on cross-cutting issues that touch on their areas of expertise, including capacity building, vulnerability of the developing countries to climate change and response measures, the Kyoto Protocol mechanisms. These two meet in parallel at least twice a year. When they are not meeting in conjunction with the COP, the subsidiary bodies convene at the seat of the Secretariat in Bonn, Germany. The Kyoto Protocol. It reaffirmed the responsibilities of the countries. It set greenhouse gas targets for industrialized or advanced nations. The Kyoto Protocol in 1997, it is an internationally legally binding agreement under the Convention to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. It was adopted in Kyoto, Japan in 1997 and entered into force in the year 2005. The major feature of the protocol is that it sets binding targets for 37 industrialized countries and the European Community, which is Annex 1 countries, for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. There are 83 countries and ratifiers of the Kyoto Protocol. The activities under the Framework Convention which are related to adaptation. This was the Nairobi Work Programme and other adaptation agreements, the National Adaptation Programme of Action or the NAPAs, the National Communications and the Adaptation Funds, and under the funds they enacted the Global Environment Facility, which besides the United Nations Environment Programme, the United Nations Development Programme, the World Bank and other agencies was working towards the establishment of funds so that they could tackle climate change in a better manner. The Nairobi Work Programme. The Nairobi Work Programme on Impacts, Vulnerability and Adaptation to Climate Change assists all parties, in particularly the developing countries, including the least developed countries and small island developing states. This was to improve their understanding and assessment of the impacts, vulnerability and adaptation and make informed decisions on practical adaptation actions. The NWP was mandated by the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice as a 5-year program, that is in 2005 to 2010, whose objective was to assist all parties, particularly the developing countries, including the least developing countries and the small island developing states. This was to improve their understanding of impacts, vulnerability, adaptation of climate change, to make informed decisions. Informed decisions are when you have the knowledge, when you have the requisite data and the funds, then you can make a decision which should be in a positive manner for the protection of environment and in this case particularly climate change. So, informed decisions on practical adaptation actions and measures to respond to the climate change on a sound scientific, technical and socio-economic basis, taking into account the current and future climate change and variability. The NWTP is structured around 9 areas of work which are listed during the first phase, which ended in 2008. Workshops and expert meetings allowed parties to identify the gaps and the needs and to make recommendations for the possible next steps in each area of work. Workshops were conducted on a range of topics including climate related risks and extreme events, adaptation planning and practices, socio-economic information and climate modeling scenarios and downscaling. The second phase of the NWP emphasized activities dealing with economic diversification, adaptation, planning and practices and community, regional and national activities, including those which are based on education, training and awareness raising. In addition to this, the following forms of engagement are being enhanced throughout the second phase, which calls for action, action pledges and engaging the private sector. This Nairobi Work Programme, it is climate related risks and extreme events, adaptation planning and practices, socio-economic information, methods and tools, data and observation, economic diversification, research, climate modeling, scenarios and downscaling and technology for adaptation. The implementation of the NWP, there were activities which were mandated by the SPSTA such as workshops, technical papers, furthering the research reach of the mandated activities, which is disseminating outcomes as widely as possible, creating reader friendly versions of the Framework Convention products, catalyzing new and innovative action by the organizations within and outside of the UNFCCC process. The workshop on adaptation planning and practices in Rome in 2007 recommended organizations active in health such as WHO to develop and standardize key indicators to monitor changes in health impacts and the effectiveness of climate related risk reduction and adaptation measures and develop a strategy for climate related risk reduction and adaptation in the health sector. The workshop on climate-related risk and extreme events in Cairo in 2007 to carry out the research and surveys on the climate change impacts and health outcomes, specifically regarding the changing distribution of diseases, the identification of new risk areas and options to reduce health impacts, and subsequently disseminate the results widely to decision makers, health practitioners and communities. To develop programs and training to empower the health community to plan and implement adaptation to the climate variability and change. To develop a health strategy across agencies for distribution through medical entities that includes a common portfolio with methods and tools, best practices aimed at climate proofing the health sector and risk management techniques. It was to develop a campaign on climate change and health for children through learning oriented, that is school curriculum, and creativity oriented activities. Then comes the modes of implementation. These are activities which are mandated by the SBSTA. They are furthering the reach of the mandated activities, catalyzing new and innovative action. The NWP partner organization, institutions, experts and communities, action pledges, action by partners to engage with and enhance the work of the program. There are subsequent adaptation agreements, the Bali Action Plan, identified adaptation as one of the key building blocks, which is shared vision, mitigation, adaptation, technology and financial resources for a strengthened future response to climate change. The Cancun Adaptation Framework 2010 to enhance action on adaptation, including through international cooperation. This established a UNFCCC Adaptation Committee. Then there came the Durban Decision, the Doha Decision, the Warsaw Decision, which advanced implementation of the CAF. Subsequent adaptation agreements, which was COP13 in Bali, Conference of the Parties launched a comprehensive program process to enable the full, effective and sustained implementation of the convention through the long-term cooperative action up to and beyond 2012. The mandate regarding this process is contained in the decision called the Bali Action Plan. Key objectives are to enable climate resilient development and reduce the vulnerability of all parties, in particular the poor ones that would be hit the hardest because of climate change. The Bali Action Plan determines essential actions to adapt to the inevitable impacts of climate change and promote climate resilient development. It identifies adaptation as one of the 5 key blocks for a strengthened response to climate change. The other elements are mitigation, which is stopping, technology, finances and a shared vision for a long-term cooperative action. Adaptation in the Bali Plan pays special attention to the developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change, which includes the LDCs, SIDS and countries in Africa affected by drought, desertification and floods. The national communications. All parties must report on the steps they are taking or envisage undertaking to implement the convention. The National Communications Annex 1. National communications from non-Annex 1 parties. Under the convention, all parties should report that they are taking to implement the convention in accordance with the principle of common but differentiated responsibility enshrined in the convention. The required contents of this national communications and the timetable for their submission is different for Annex 1 and Annex 2 non-Annex 1 parties. Annex 1 parties or the developed countries as negotiated under the convention provide for national communications on a regular schedule. Most of the 41 Annex 1 parties submitted their first national communications in 1994 or 1995, their second in 1997 to 1998 and the third in 2001 to 2002. Since 1996, Annex 1 parties also submit an annual inventory of their greenhouse gas emissions to the Secretariat. Each non-Annex 1 party was supposed to submit its initial communication within 3 years of the entry into force of the convention and for that party or of the availability of the financial resources, except for the least developed countries who did so at their discretion. All parties have completed their first national communications, most their second, and some are working on their fourth. The National Adaptation Programs for Action, which is NAPA. NAPA provides for important way to prioritize urgent adaptation needs for the least developed countries. They drew on the existing information and community level input to identify adaptation projects which were required now in order to enable these countries to cope with the immediate impacts of climate change. NAPA was a process to identify and prioritize urgent and immediate adaptation needs. Those which could further delay would increase vulnerability and the cost at a later stage for the least developed countries. NAPA drew on existing information and community level input to identify adaptation projects required now in order to enable these countries to cope with the immediate impacts of climate change. NAPA was action oriented and country driven, flexible and based on the national circumstances. Steps for preparation of the NAPA includes synthesis of available information, participatory assessment of vulnerability to current climate variability and extreme events of areas where risk would increase due to climate change, identification of key adaptation measures and criteria for prioritizing activities and selection of a prioritized short list of activities. The adaptation funds, the least developed country fund. Now, there were 4 kinds of funds which were adapted. As I stated, the least developed country fund, the special climate change fund, which set up finance projects relating to adaptation, technology transfer, capacity building, energy, transport, industry, agriculture, forestry, waste management and economic diversification. The third one was the adaptation fund, which was set up under the Kyoto Protocol to finance the full cost of adaptation in developing countries that were parties to the Kyoto Protocol. It was to be replaced by the Green Climate Fund and which was ultimately done. The Green Climate Fund, these were the 4 adaptation funds under the convention. Despite several years of negotiation, the fund is now only operational. The Green Climate Fund was recently agreed with its mandate and process still to be determined. The Global Environment Facility, the agency which is responsible for the distribution of the funds and is a helping agency for the convention. It has a global partnership among 178 countries to address global environmental issues supporting the nationally sustainable development initiatives. The designated financial mechanism for the United Nations Framework Convention, the GEF supports projects in climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. It is a global partnership among 178 countries, international institutions, NGOs and the private sector to address global environmental issues while supporting the national sustainable development issues. GEF is designated as the financial mechanism for a number of multilateral environmental agreements or conventions, including the UNFCCC. It assists countries in meeting their obligations under the convention that have been signed and ratified. These conventions and the MEAs provide guidance to the 2 governing bodies of the GEF, which is the GEF Council and the GEF Assembly. The GEF, it is the largest funder of projects to improve the global environment. Since 1991, it provided 8.26 billion in grants and leveraged 33.7 billion in co-financing for over 2,200 projects in over 165 countries. It provides grants for projects related to the following 6 focal areas, which is biodiversity, climate change, international waters, land degradation, ozone layer and the persistent organic pollutants. Its projects in climate change help developing countries and the countries with economies in transition to contribute to the overall objective of the UNFCCC, which is stabilizing the greenhouse gases concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. It has allocated and dispersed $250 million per year in projects in energy efficiency, renewable energy and sustainable transportation. It manages the Least Developed Countries Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund. It supports projects in climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. The crucial situation of the agreements. There are limitations on mitigation action. Kyoto Protocol inadequate to meaningfully reduce the climate change. There are possible mitigation measures have very different health implications. No obligation for developing nations that will become large emitters in the near future and which have come to be so. There are problems with adaptation. Funding from the rich nations is voluntary and complex to access. Health is poorly represented. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it was formed in 1988 under the UNEP and the World Meteorological Organization to conduct assessments of the state of knowledge of climate change, the vulnerabilities to and consequences of any changes and the options to avoid, prepare or respond to changes. It is signed, all governments that signed either the UNEP or the WMO Convention are members of the IPCC. The organization IPCC is divided into 4 parts. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was formed in 1988 by the UNEP and the World Meteorological Organization to conduct assessments of the state of knowledge of climate change, the vulnerabilities to and consequences of any changes and the options to avoid, prepare or respond to changes. All governments have signed either the UNEP or WMO Convention are members of the IPCC. The IPCC organization is, as displayed in this figure, has 4 working groups. It has a secretariat, it has a bureau, there is a working group 1 which is of the physical science basis. The working group 2 is of climate change impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. The working group 3 is mitigation of climate change, and then there is the task force on national greenhouse gas inventories. The working of the IPCC, it holds annual meetings for plenaries where the government representatives meet to take decisions relative to the work of the IPCC. They support the work of the working groups. A bureau meets twice a year to discuss progress on assessment reports and other related issues. The IPCC Secretariat supports the work of the plenary and the bureau. It is based in Geneva. The task force on national greenhouse gas inventories is based in Japan, and the report is to conduct the assessments. There have been 3 working groups, one on physical science, the other one on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, and one on mitigation. The number and focus of working groups is up to the plenary. There are many discussions on possible organizations. Each working group is led by 2 chairs, one from the developed and one from the developing countries. A technical support unit supports each working group. The assessment reports are the work of the authors, contributors and reviewers. The role of the governments are to scientific community to conduct assessments, bureau to ensure assessments. Proposed outlines are discussed and approved line by line by the governments in a plenary. Bureau approves the chapter authors. They participate in the review process. The summary of the policy makers approved line by line by the governments in the final plenary. They are members of the IPC. They request the scientific community to conduct assessments, and the rules and procedures are adopted, and each representative from the WMO region. They discuss and approve outlines for assessment reports. The working bureau approves the author teams for the working group. Authors are chosen for scientific expertise. There is a review process of the report, and the last step of an assessment report is for governments to approve the summary of the policy makers. This is done in plenary where the SPM is discussed and approved line by line. The conclusion of the international law related to climate change is, it is an international process for negotiating agreements on climate change. A series of agreements have been reached on promoting adaptation, including international funding for adaptation. Health has been poorly representative, and IPCC panel provides comprehensive scientific assessments to inform the negotiations. Now comes India's role. There are two dimensions in India's climate change policy. One is the India's external position in the climate change negotiations, and the other is India's domestic. It has been a proactive participant in development of the regime. The passing of the UNGA resolution was called on member states to urgently prepare a framework convention to address this problem, and India has articulated its views on climate change. Conference of Selecting Developing Countries on Global Environmental Issues convened in New Delhi in 1990, the first of its kind for developing countries. The responsibility to reduce greenhouse gas emissions causing the problem of climate change rested on the developed world, and they were the ones who were responsible. The developing countries had very low and needed to grow to meet their future development and the poverty reduction needs. So, India continued to emphasize that there is no legal responsibility. Any voluntary mitigation measures it needed to consistent with the national development plans and priorities. The full incremental costs involved for the same would need to be provided through to new and additional financial resources from the developed world. The latter would need to provide developing countries with assured access to technology. So, finances and technology were necessary. Although it was not able to give everything which it wanted, such as agreement of the per capita convergence, it was unable to get from its preference. These were the following what it specifically got: that party should protect the climate system based on equity and the CBDR principle. Developing countries with new and additional financial resources to meet not only the increased costs but also implementing mitigation and adaptation measures, and also agreed full costs of preparing the national communications and other reporting requirements. The economic and social development and poverty eradication was the first and the overriding priorities, and the convention clearly distinguished between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries. So, India's domestic policy, as we see, there was the National Action Plan on Climate Change. It was India's foundation or the policy document where it committed to reduce the GHGs emissions. There was mission on solar energy, mission on advanced energy efficiency, water mission, sustainable habitat, sustaining the Himalayan ecosystems, creating a green India through afforestation, sustainable agriculture, and a strategic knowledge for climate change. The state action plans on climate change were based on the above court's order to prepare such plans at the state level, and 34 Indian states and union territories have prepared these consistent with the objectives of the NAPCC. Initiative on Climate Resilient Agriculture. It was launched by the Indian Council of Agricultural Research. The objective was to enhance resilience of crops, livestock and fisheries. The projects were for adaptation and mitigation, technology demonstration to farmers who would cope with climate change variability, sponsored and competitive research grants, and capacity building of the stakeholders. The GRIHA, the Green Rating for Integrated Habitat Assessment, it was conceived by TERI and it was developed by the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. The objective was to evaluate greenness of the buildings. Benefits of GRIHA buildings are, it is reduce energy consumption without sacrificing the comfort levels, and the related list which has been given. The green buildings is practice of creating structures and using processes that are environmentally responsible and resource efficient throughout a building's life cycle, which is construction, operation, maintenance, renovation and deconstruction. Designed to reduce the overall impact of the built environment on human and environmental health. The Climate Change Action Program, it was science plan of LTEO, which is long-term ecological observatories. The first phase, health assessment of the following regions. It aims to understand physical and anthropogenic drivers. Activities include assessment of change of structure and function. National Adaptation Fund for Climate Change was introduced in 2015-16 to be revised in 2020. It was meant to assess national and state level activities for areas vulnerable to climate change. NABARD, as the national implementing agency, support adaptive activities. The FAME India programs, the first program was in 2020, is a national mission document showing the vision and roadmap of a faster adoption of electric vehicles, adoption of manufacturing hybrid and electric vehicles in India, heavy industry to promote these vehicles. The second phase talks about a strong demand by way of supporting 7,000 e-buses and electric vehicles again. The programs and alliances, there is a green credit program which is transcending to the commercial nature of carbon credits. The Global Biofuel Alliance under India's G20 presidency, India led this initiative. International Solar Alliance, where solar energies would be driving to a sustainable growth. Panchamrit, which is non-fossil energy capacity by 2030, 50% of energy requirements from renewable energy. Total projected carbon emissions of 1 billion tons from now to 2030 and zero emissions by 2070. Other Indian policies are the Green Climate Fund, where it has pledged contributions and encourages G20 members to increase their support. Nationally determined contributions, which is to cut emissions and adapt to the climate impacts. 2022, it updated its NDC and has a target to reduce emissions intensity of its GDP by 45% by 2030 from 2005 levels. And it has also supported the common but differentiated responsibility principle. Thank you.
Hello everybody. Now the discussion which I would try to talk to you is about the excitement which I always feel, and I am sure you will also reciprocate as I proceed and when you do the course, is in the area of multivariate statistical problems and multivariate statistical analysis. So, what we mean by multivariate? So, we know that statistics is a subject where you have a lot of data, you try to analyze that using different type of techniques like estimation problem, MCMC techniques, then forecasting and the area of time series analysis, and then try to basically find out the best forecasting tool which you have, such that you are able to gain the maximum amount of information from a set of data. Now, in the recent past, as we see that multivariate statistics has really increased in a very exciting manner, and if I trace back to history, it has been going on slowly for the last about 70-80 years, but now the time has come where it is being used in a very big way, and the techniques which we all know, but which are being utilized with new vigor are in the area of, say for example, canonical correlation technique, in the area of factor analysis, in the area of conjoint analysis, in the area of clustering analysis, in the area of multi-dimensional scaling techniques, structural equation modeling, be it in the area of finance, be it in the area of engineering, be it in the area of social sciences, be it in the area of economics, such that you are able to gather the information from the data in such a way that it really gives you some useful set of information. Now, in the recent past, there has been also an explosion of large and complex data sets, but added to that there has also been a a commensurate increase in the computing and the statistical techniques. So, obviously, the question comes that if the statistical techniques are there for so called small data, not the big data, not the data which is of terabytes and so on and so forth, where you use different type of computers to store the data, the question obviously comes that are those statistical techniques really relevant when we use them in the big data sense. The question is, they are not always relevant, they may not give you the best results. So, what we are seeing in years to come, and I feel very excited about that, is that how the new tools which we have already learned in statistics, in multivariate statistical analysis, are being redrawn, are being, say for example, remodeled in such a way that they can be utilized along with the techniques of computing in a very nice manner, that we are able to garner the information from big data very successfully and very nicely in such a way that they are able to portray a sense of information which we all long to have from big data, be it in, say for example, medical sciences, be in the area of finance, be it in weather forecasting, be it in transportation, so on and so forth. So, obviously, it means that students, participants who are in a position with some brief mathematical background to take multivariate statistics and statistical tools as a subject in this program are assured of a very exciting future, where they can use these tools to both gain the knowledge as well utilize them in a very best practical sense, such that they are able to do some justice to the information which is given to them and get the best information from the data sets. I wish all the participants in this course the best of luck, and I am sure they will also reciprocate the excitement which I have for this type of courses. Thank you.